Yo, what's up Instagram? So I've been meaning to make this video for a while, debunking Vaush's points from our previous debate on whether the term indigenous European is superior than white. It is my contention that of course it is, because white is far more ambiguous than indigenous European. White includes people like North Africans and Middle Easterners. During our debate, Vaush contradicted himself many a times, and it's those contradictions that we are going to examine today.
For a group to be indigenous, you think there has to be a dichotomy between colonialism and an indigenous group?
Yeah, oh yeah, definitely. Because otherwise, like, what are we even referring to? Because indigenous is usually a term that we use to juxtapose colonialist groups. Usually when we say indigenous, it's in relationship to the existence of people who came there later. But that relationship doesn't really exist in Europe. History of Europe is literally dozens or even hundreds of completely some different and sometimes very comparable ethnic groups, like brutally slaughtering each other.
The history of the Americas is the same, comparable and different ethnic groups slaughtering each other. This is a native Alaskan, this is a native Amazonian. Can you see the difference? Phenotypically, they're quite incomparable, right? Diversity.
Saying indigenous Europeans to draw some kind of presupposed inherent relationship between white people in Europe to the exclusion of other groups.
I mean, that's
no, there's not. No, black and brown people have been there for thousands of years.
And so have white people been in North America for thousands of years, in Africa and in Asia.
Wait. No. A few Viking settlements over the course of 2,000 years does not give white people the same kind of historical placement in the Americas as the indigenous people who were there before.
And a few Moors that inhabited
millions of East Asian, African, and Arab people. I know you haven't looked up the history on this because no historian ever tries to draw these distinctions.
So to his first point of dismissing European settlements of North America over 1,000 years ago, this is from the Greenland government website. And let's just have a look at the history of Greenland, because this is part of North America. So the Norsemen arrived in Greenland 982 AD. There are cultural settlements all over Greenland from indigenous European people. So from this 2016 scientific book from Estabrook, you can see that there was around 6,000 Norsemen in Greenland. And it could have been as high as 9,000 in Greenland 1,000 years ago. The Vikings had continual ownership of large part of North America for close to 500 years. This is not insignificant. Even in the 1750s, there was less than 10,000 Inuit people of Greenland. So there was more Norsemen 1,000 years ago in Greenland than there were in the 1750s Inuit people. Now we can move on to his second point, where he's being a hypocrite, because he dismissed Europeans in North America as insignificant, but he's trying to say that the population of black and brown people in medieval Europe was significant.
And a few Moors that inhabited
millions of East Asian, African, and Arab people. I know you haven't looked up the history on this because no historian ever tries to draw these distinctions.
Hold up, no search results for the millions of East Asians in ancient Europe? He said that no historians ever disputed this, but it seems that no historians ever even written about it. On a serious note, if anyone has any sources to prove that there were millions of East Asians and millions of Africans and millions of Arabs all living and singing Kumbaya in Europe in the medieval times, source me please, because I really cannot find it. What someone considers significant in terms of population size is largely subjective to the person and therefore irrelevant. What's significant is the fact that there were thousands of native Europeans that inhabited North America over 1,000 years ago, and this had continual settlement for over 500 years. If you're going to say that the Vikings had too small a population to validate them as Native American status, then I'm going to say the same thing about these millions of blacks and browns that you talk about in medieval Europe, that I haven't found a source for, by the way. Because proportionate to the rest of Europe, they're still a tiny minority.
It's more arbitrary than the term European, because there is an actual place called Europe, and that's where our ancestors have lived for thousands of years. Whereas
and black and brown people have been there for thousands of years. Yeah, too. They're right now in this moment in time, black and brown people in Europe, and they're European just as much as any other fucking white person over there.
And whites have been in North America for 1,000 years and in Africa for over 1,000 years too.
About Romani and Jewish people, how do you feel about those? Would those be indigenous European people to you?
No, because the Romani came from, they're indigenous to northern India, and then they came into Europe about 800 years ago. Whereas there was already Europeans that were living there for thousands of years prior.
But there are ethnic groups in Europe that only came there. The Slavs, for example, would have been like less recently than that. 800 years isn't enough time to be ethnically indigenous to the area you're in?
Firstly, the Slavs are indigenous European. They come from Greater Europe. Of course, they migrated in closer to continental Europe, but they're still broadly from Europe, and their phenotypical characteristics are evidence of this. Secondly, you are trying to say that Roma can claim indigenous European status because they've lived in Europe for 800 years, but you are denying Vikings Native American status when they lived there over 1,000 years. Do you not see the hypocrisy here?
Well, I mean, white people have lived in North America for over 1,000 years.
North America?
Yeah, in Alaska, the Viking settlements, Leif Erikson.
Yeah, but broadly, most of the Americas were not white. They just like one or two like Viking settlements isn't exactly living in the entirety of the continents. Like those were temporary settlements.
Okay, it wasn't just a few Viking settlements. The majority of Greenland's population for 500 years were indigenous European. And secondly, this is a false equivalency, okay? Europe is far smaller than the Americas. You're really going to compare North America, Central America, and South America to a tiny continent like Europe? This is Texas, one state from one country in North America compared to Europe. Europe is not that big, so to compare Europe to all of the Americas and say that we could only claim indigenous status if we covered the entirety of the Americas is illogical because Europe is just so much smaller. The fact is that there are indigenous Europeans that inhabited a large part of North America for close to 500 years. To trivialize this as a few Viking settlements, no.
I'd be willing to bet that if we could 23andMe every single white person in Europe, that a minority of them would actually have like pure blood descendants from the original ethnic groups from their area, and that most of them are just like a complete hodgepodge.
So what, like a hodgepodge from any continental grouping? Like these people here? Look at the diversity.
I feel like there has been some mixing in Europe, but there's been mixing in every population. To split hairs and say, oh, there's been a little bit more mixing in Europe than in North America. So they
not a little bit, a fuckload more. North America, it was just Native Americans and a few Viking settlements.
Get a DNA.
Just Native Americans. Look at them. They're just one homogenous group. They certainly didn't come at different times and have different evolutions and have different customs and cultures and wars between one another. Nope, they are one group. Native Americans. That's how they identified before we came there.
Like Southern Europeans especially, because there's like 10, maybe 15% of non-European admixture in their population. You're saying that they're no longer native.
They were never I don't use the term Native European. Why can't we just talk about different specific ethnic groups?
Because you said there's Native Americans racially.
Yes, because they were locked off for 15,000 years. Europe has for its entire existence.
You're saying that Native Europeans don't exist because of race mixing, but Native Americans now are heavily race mixed. So how can they?
Because the designation doesn't make any sense when those black and brown people have been in Europe for thousands of years too.
Your designation doesn't make any sense either, because white people have lived in America for 1,000 years also. We've lived in Africa for over 1,000 years. We've lived in the Middle East for over 1,000 years. So who was native? Just the Native Americans? They're not a homogenous tribe. If you're going to consider them indigenous, then you have to consider the Indo-Europeans as indigenous to Europe.
With Europe has been a smorgasbord of colonizers and colonized people for thousands of years. Different groups of people that we would now consider white, that didn't call themselves white back in the day, slaughtering and raping each other, creating half-breeds, and then slaughtered and raped the next group of half-breeds, which were then taken over by the fucking Saracens or Moors, which then grew a new civilization, then died, and then the group split into 18,000 tribes, and then they destroyed the next civilization over, and the entire time we have trade happening from Africa and the Arab world and from Southeast Asia, and we have like no fucking idea which ethnic groups have any broad connection. The Native American ethnic groups have literally like 10,000 years of specific social, historical, and cultural precedent in their area. The same cannot be said of Europe. So
everything he said there could be applied to the Native Americans. They had different migrations, they came at different times, they had different languages, they warred between one another, they had intersex, and then they had half-breeds of different tribes, and there was 18,000 Native American tribes. Like, it's crazy. I think it's really racist that Vaush thinks that the Native Americans or Asians were too stupid to figure out how to cross this 100 kilometers straight once the land bridge was gone. Like, how simple does he think that these people were? They didn't have canoes. Like, this isn't a very long distance, you know. So saying that they were cut off for 15,000 years is illogical because there was continual migration, I guarantee it. They weren't that stupid, Vaush. Give them some credit. I mean, it's only 5 times further than the closest point from Africa to Europe. North Africans and Europeans even figured out how to cross the entire Mediterranean, which is over 7 times further than Native Americans or Native Asians would have had to cross to go back and forth between Asia and North America. I guarantee there was continual migration, and those continual migrations were of different ethnic groups, so there was never a pure Native American race.
Geographical territorial habitats. So,
or ancestral territories.
Right, so that precludes 98% of people in Europe, considering that for thousands of years, these motherfuckers have been raping, pillaging, and displacing each other within, like, a broader, like, continental space.
Once again, you could say that for any continental grouping, these wars were largely between other indigenous Europeans, okay? Native Americans were fighting amongst other Native Americans. Native Africans were fighting amongst other Native Africans. You war with people who are closest to you. This shouldn't come as a surprise.
But you could refer to, like, Germans as indigenous Europeans. Like, they're indigenous in the sense that they're confined to Europe, but they're, like, ethnically German. But they're still indigenous to the continent.
No, what do you mean indigenous to the continent? Do you think when the WHO says it with a specific, like, geographical attachment, they mean to a continent?
No, but when we talk about like Native Americans, we're talking about a continent.
No, because so individual Native American tribes have their own areas.
But the term Native American refers broadly to North America, or...
Well, it refers broadly to hundreds of tribes that all have their own historical, geographical territories across 2 continents.
And you could say that about Europe as well. It refers to hundreds of tribes.
No, because there aren't tribes anymore. It's just a bunch of nation states that formed after thousands of years of infighting.
Nation states formed by tribes. This is what happens. This is how states are made. One final point is that Vaush said there needs to be a colonizer-colonized relationship to determine indigenous status. Well, this isn't true, but even if it was, if this were true, then you wouldn't consider the Moors to be indigenous Europeans, even though they've been in Europe for 1,000 years, because they came over as colonizers. So this invalidates these millions of blacks and browns that you were talking about, I guess, Vaush. Anyway, please like, subscribe, and I'm out.